All right, so before we dive into advanced tools and really building things, I want to take a moment to review the basics of geometric objects because we haven't really explored those too in depth. We took a bit of a look at them in the last project, kind of utilizing vertices to shape our ground and have a more organic look. So let's go ahead and start there with the basic components of a geometric object. To get started, I'm going to come up here to create, go into polygon primitives and grab a cube. While I'm here, notice NURBS is here. So these are those non-rational B-splines I mentioned, but we want to focus on polygons. So we're going to come in here to polygon primitives, grab this cube here, and I'm going to hit F to frame up on it, and we can see this beautiful cube. Now, the way you access an object's components is by right-clicking on the object, and this will bring up a swizzle menu where you can select the different component types. The most basic component type is the vertex. The vertex is going to give us these individual little points here that we can select and we can move and manipulate. Vertices, at the end of the day, are really what an object is built of, and it's important to keep that in mind, especially when you get into the higher end of 3D and you start dealing with various things like digital sculpting and point clouds. Now, we don't work with vertices that much when we're modeling. Our large focus tends to be on edges. And if you right click and access edges, these are the sides running between 2 points. And faces, which are the areas in between. So those are going to be the areas we focus on quite a bit when modeling. When beginning modeling, there's a lot of different approaches we can take. And starting with a cube is actually my favorite. But there's an important thing we need to understand before we ever get started, which is there's a specialized node that every object is created with. This is going to be that object's shape node. Now, if we come up here into the channel box, we can actually see this. Coming over here to the side, you'll see that there is a polycube1 input. And whenever you create a primitive object, you will see this input there. What this allows us to do is initialize the shape of the object, which allows us to manipulate the amount of information it comes with. Now, when I talk about information, what I'm talking about is vertices. I'm talking about edges and faces. So a cube is really the bare bones object. You end up with 6 faces, and that's what you get. But you might want to have more faces to manipulate to begin with without using any sort of tools to add them. The input here is going to be how we can achieve that. You'll notice that there are a lot of different ways we can modify it. For example, we can come in here and we can adjust things like the width. And the way I'm doing this is by middle mouse button dragging. And notice that this width is affecting the vertices. It's not affecting the scale. So we can actually manipulate the shape of something without affecting its scale. And now if we use the scale tool to do something like animation, we can maintain this as our 1-to-1 ratio rather than having to remember some strange number for scale. I don't really use these personally when it comes to the width, height, and depth here, but they are definitely tools you can use, and I want to introduce them to you because everyone's workflow is a bit different. You may find these to be more useful starting, and there are certain projects where this might be ideal. Now, the next thing which can be very useful is going to be things like subdivision, width, height, and depth. When we talk about subdivision, subdividing means to cut in half. So, for example, if I look at something like the width, I might be cutting along this direction with a subdivision line, and what that means is it's going to add an edge loop around here. Now, an edge loop is a term you should pay attention to. An edge loop is a continuous loop that wraps around a geometric form. These are going to be very important for modeling because they allow us to work more easily, believe it or not, because it's just continuous. We can actually select it as all one thing and grab and move the whole chunk, which is nice. But they're also very important for animation because they're going to affect something called deformation, or how an object deforms. And this becomes extremely important when we're building organic things like a character who's going to have a leg that bends. Previously, we looked at a non-organic form like a robot where everything moves as a chunk. In that case, it's not as important, but for organic surfaces like living animals or even just things that move organically like rubber tubing, something like that, it is important to have these. So that is what these subdivisions are going to do. Now, we can add these in with other tools, and we will look at that, but the perk of using this is the fact that it places it evenly spaced on the surface, which can be very useful depending on what we're building. We might want to have a perfectly center line, or we might want to have evenly spaced lines. So this is actually a section of the initialize menu I do use quite often when I'm modeling, and you can pair it with the width and height up here as well, depending on what your needs are. So let's explore that. I'm going to click on subdivision width here, and I can just middle mouse drag to add more and more and more of these edges, or less and less and less, depending on what I want. Now notice it's only adding them along that width division. If I wanted to, let's say, have a line down the middle and a line down the front, I could add one to the height. And you can see now we're splitting that into little quadrants. And I could do the same thing with depth over here. And now you can see we've added a substantially larger amount of vertices for us to work with. This will enable us to create more advanced looking shapes. And later on, we can utilize this for other effects, which we'll look at. Now there's a create UV section. Don't worry about this. I probably should know this better, but I personally have never used this. I think it might be useful. And I'm also not familiar with height baseline. It looks like it just adjusted based on the grid, which can actually be very useful because let's say you wanted it to be at 0, 0. That could be a good starting point. I usually just adjust this manually, but good to know we can do it here. So that is the basis of the initialize. And like I mentioned, we can now use this for other things. So let's say I wanted to start shaping this into something different. I can now come into something like my faces, and I can just grab the section. And you can see we can create a shape that we haven't seen before. I can then come into the vertex here and pull this down. And now I have this nice little wedge shape that we wouldn't have been able to create previously. Now, let's explore the initialize on a few more objects. We'll come up here to create. We can go into our polygon primitives. And let's go ahead and take a look at something like a cylinder, since this is a bit unique. We use cylinders quite a bit in the last project. If you click on the cylinder here, you'll see that you gain access to the polycylinder input. And we have similar tools as we had with the cube. You have things like the height baseline, where we can change where it's at respect to the grid. We also have radius, which can change the width of this, which can be very useful if you don't want to make it higher. Notice it's only scaling outward. We have the height, so we can adjust height. Now here's where things get interesting with the subdivision axes. By default, it's just a cylinder, but let's say we wanted a hexagon. I could bring this down to 6 sides. And now I have a hexagon, which could be useful for creating something like a bolt. Or let's say we wanted something completely different, like a triangle. We could also achieve that in cylindrical form. This is where these inputs come in handy because it removes a lot of the work you might have to do creating something like a hexagon. Another really cool thing we can do is add subdivision caps here with subdivision height. So this way we can manipulate this to look different. So let's say I was going to create a vase here. We could go ahead and increase the height a little bit here. We could add in more subdivision axes along the height here. And we could manipulate these using our modeling tools. Now, I mentioned that these edge loops were going to come in handy. If you right-click and go to edge mode, you'll see single-clicking selects an edge, but double-clicking can select an edge loop. And then we could hit scale, and we could use scale to scale this inward. And I could double-click to the next edge loop and scale that inward, and double-click to the next one and scale that. Then I could come down to the bottom and scale this, and to the very last one here and scale this in. And you can see now I've already shaped this into something that starts to look a bit like a vase or some sort of a container that is a lot fancier than a cylinder. Now, something to be aware of, like I mentioned when we started modeling, is that Maya's history is not that useful. Notice that this is still here. Be cautious that editing this after you've made adjustments like what I have just done quite often results in it getting very much destroyed. So let's say I come to subdivision height here and I add in another one and another one and another one. You'll see that it's going to change the outcome. Let's say I reduce them. You'll see that also changes the outcome. But it's doing a pretty good job maintaining our shape. But what happens if I change the subdivision axes from 10? Ooh, that is a mess. So you can see that it's really only capable of processing the data along a single channel accurately. So just be aware that this initialize input here is great for getting started, but really it's not that great for continuing forward. Now, a couple more things to note on the cylinder that are useful is going to be things like subdivision caps here. If I go ahead and increase this, you can see those caps there. They add it to the top. That will be useful later on. You can also see options here like round cap off. If we go ahead and set that to 1 to turn it on, you can actually round the top of a cylinder, which is useful. And we have another option here to kind of modify that to compensate back. Now, that might be better seen on a fresh cylinder, so I'm going to delete that one, and we can take a look at that and see how that goes. And you'll see as I add in these subdivision caps, we can actually create a capsule shape. Now, this once again is one of those really neat things where, looking at this would be a shape that we couldn't normally generate. You can see we can create some really cool things there with the cylinder. Similarly, you can do work with a sphere in the same direction. So if we come into a spheres input, you can see that we can change the radius down and once again get one of these very interesting sort of shapes that is non-spherical. It's not quite as dynamic, I would say, as what we were seeing previously with the cylinder, but very useful. The last thing I want to look at in terms of just kind of initial inputs is some of the more advanced tools like the gear. If you come here to the gear, this is something they added newer to Maya. It hasn't been in here that long, and it's a really advanced tool that allows us to create a wide range of shapes. So I'm going to create a gear here and come to its poly inputs. And you can see with these, we can make all sorts of different changes. So if I come to sides, we can really change how this gear looks quite dynamically. You'll see as I add the sides, it adds more of those gear cogs. We can adjust the radius, which is going to be the outward size. And you'll see that those little prongs adjust interactively. We have the internal radius, which is the circle. We can adjust the thickness there. We obviously have the height. That's self-explanatory. Height divisions, number of divisions along the height baseline, right? We're familiar with these by now. But then we get to these really unique ones like gear spacing, the distance between the gears. And this allows us to create a very different look. For example, if I change this to have a smaller amount of size, I could change this to be more of a star shape. We also have gear offset, which is how far out these go. So you can see it's starting to look a bit like a plane propeller here. We can change the tip to be tapered or not. We can also change the gear middle, which is going to taper or not. Now, another really neat thing we can do is twist. And you can see just like that, we've used this gear to create something like a fan or a propeller for a boat. So when it comes to creating a fan or a propeller or any sort of thing like that, it's this very complex object. But if you understand with the initialize that you can achieve this, you can see how easily we can actually build an object this complex. We also have tapering, so we can actually make it flare outwards or flare inwards, and it gives us a really wide range of tools. Okay, so that is going to be the Polygon Primitives gear. The last thing I want to leave you with is going to be a hotkey. Now, let's go ahead and use one we haven't looked at, like the Helix here. This is a really cool tool that's great for making any sort of threaded surface, springs, that kind of stuff. If you don't want to go into the channel box here, you can also hit the T key on your keyboard with an object selected to access its initialized data. So once we hit T, you'll see it will actually float this menu, and you'll see these menus are pretty much identical. So notice there are some differences, but they are for the most part the same. So you can see coils here, we can change the number of coils, and as I change it here, it changes it over there in the channel box. We have height, this is going to change the height. We have width, which is going to change the overall width. We have radius, which is going to change the radius. Subdivision axes, subdivision coils, and subdivision caps. So you can see we can access all of these over here, which is really cool. But there are a few things that we can't. For example, the UV editing, we can't access the round caps. So if you did want to use round caps here, you can see that is located over there. So we would need to access that. And also the height baseline. So those are all things that we don't have access to with the initialize hotkey here with T. So just be aware of that, but that is going to be initializing polygons, okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to get familiar with each object from the primitive menu to explore what kind of shapes you can create with them. Just go down the list here, come up here to create polygon primitive, start with a sphere, work your way down to an ultra shape, and just kind of briefly acquaint yourself with what you can achieve and see what kind of cool objects you can make. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is just go through each of these, go into their inputs, play with those different channels, understand what they do, how they work, and then we'll go ahead and continue forward and we'll discuss a technique inside of Maya called subdivision.